On the morning of October 19, 2023, Dr. Elliot Voss opened his private log to find an entry he had no memory of writing. A precise, clinical description of his own murder, dated 2 weeks in the future, written in his own handwriting, in his own shorthand, on a page that hadn't existed the night before. By the time anyone else read that log, Elliot Voss would already be dead. And the thing that makes this story truly unbearable, the detail that investigators would quietly leave out of every official report, is that the description of how he died was not just accurate. It was exact. Down to the smell. Down to the temperature of the room. Down to the sound he made when it was over. Someone or something had written him a preview, and he had 2 weeks to decide whether to believe it. Elliot Voss was 51 years old and had been a board-certified anesthesiologist at Hargrove Memorial Hospital in Portland, Oregon for nearly 2 decades. He was the kind of man that patients never really remembered, which was, in a way, the whole point. He arrived before the fear got too loud. He administered the chemical that pulled consciousness out from under you like a tablecloth from a set table. He watched you go under. And what those particular entries had in common, the detail that Elliot had spent 11 years trying to rationalize, trying to explain away, trying to file under coincidence or subconscious projection or the strange theater of a dreaming mind, is the detail that should have made him destroy the log entirely. Every single one of them came true. He read the October 19th entry 3 times standing in his kitchen, still in the clothes he'd slept in, the coffee going cold beside him. He thought about Carol Ashby, the woman who had started it all in 2012, murmuring her structured sentence in the deepest trench of sedation. He had never published anything about his log, never shared it, never even hinted at its existence. But that morning, for the first time in 11 years, he found himself trying to remember exactly what Carol Ashby had said. He had written it down that first evening in the original notebook, the one that was now buried in the back of his study closet under a stack of journals he hadn't opened since 2017. He had the strange, cold certainty that it mattered now in a way it hadn't before. He went to work because he didn't know what else to do, and because the alternative, staying inside the narrow Victorian house with the frost-printed step and the open-door question, felt worse than the routine. He held that position for approximately 6 hours, through 2 more procedures, through a department briefing he barely heard, through a lunch he didn't eat. At 4:17 in the afternoon, he took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The hallway was quiet in the specific way that hospital hallways were quiet in the late afternoon, the overhead fluorescence slightly too bright, the floor slightly too clean, the sound of the building's ventilation system an almost subsonic murmur that you felt more in your chest than heard with your ears. He walked to his office. The frosted glass panel in the door was dark, which meant the interior light was off. He stood outside the door for a long moment. He could smell it from the hallway. Faint, chemical bitter, like something medicinal that had turned, like the ghost of a clean smell inside something older and wrong, like propofol residue, but older, decayed. He put his hand on the door handle. He felt the cold of it through his palm. A cold that had nothing to do with the building's temperature, a cold that seemed to be coming from the other side, specifically directionally, as though the handle itself were being held from within. He opened the door, and in the chair behind his desk, in the darkness, in the 58-degree air that rolled out over him like a held breath finally released, something was sitting in exactly the position the log had described. Palms up, arranged. But it wasn't a body. It was his chair, empty, with the notebook open on the desk in front of it to a page he had never written. And on that page, in his handwriting, were the words, "*, you should not have come in today. Now I know what you look like when you're afraid. *. He stood in the doorway for a long time. The cold moved against his face like breath from an open freezer. Not the cold of a malfunctioning HVAC system, not the cold of a window left ajar, but something purposeful, something with direction and weight, pressing outward from the room as though the room itself were exhaling. The chemical bitter smell wrapped around him the moment he crossed the threshold. Propofol. Decayed propofol. The smell of sedation gone wrong, gone old, gone somewhere it was never supposed to go. He turned on the light. His office resolved into its ordinary geometry. The desk, the shelves, the single window overlooking the parking structure where his car sat 6 floors below in the gray October dusk. The chair was empty. The room was empty. And yet the temperature was wrong in a way that the overhead light could not correct, in a way that had nothing to do with light at all. He walked to the desk. He looked at the notebook. The new entry was 3 paragraphs long. Written in his shorthand. Written in the slightly right-leaning slant of his hand when he was tired, which was a detail that no one alive would have known to replicate, because it was a detail he had never noticed about himself until this moment, looking at writing that was both absolutely his and absolutely not. He read it standing up because he would not sit in that chair. Not with the palms-up arrangement still vivid in his mind, the word the original entry had used, arranged, still sitting in his chest like a stone. The new entry said 3 things. The first was an instruction. * Go home. Retrieve the first notebook. Read what Carol Ashby said in full. *. The second was a clarification. * You have been documenting it for 11 years. It has been documenting you for longer. *. The third was this. * The appointment on November 2nd is not something we intend for you. It is something you chose. Every patient who surfaced in that corridor was trying to tell you the same thing. You were never meant to keep the log. You were meant to burn it and walk away and live out your life in the narrow house on Sycamore Hill and die an old man of ordinary causes. But you kept writing, and everything that writes gets read. *. He closed the notebook. He put it in his bag. He did not take the elevator. He took the stairs all 6 flights because something about the idea of the elevator, the enclosed box, the mechanical descent, the brief windowless passage between floors, felt suddenly and completely impossible. He walked through the west entrance. He crossed the parking structure. He found his car in the gray early dark of the October evening and sat in it for a moment without starting the engine. His bag on the passenger seat, his hands in his lap, palms up. He noticed that last detail a full 30 seconds after he'd sat down. He turned his hands over. He pressed them flat against his thighs. He drove home. The first notebook was where he'd known it would be. The back of the study closet, under the journals, inside a shoebox he hadn't opened since 2012. He lifted it out with the kind of steadiness that had stopped feeling like calm somewhere around 4 o'clock that afternoon and had started feeling like a last structural wall before collapse. He carried it to the kitchen table. He sat under the overhead light. The house was very quiet around him, the old wood and dry paper smell of it close and pressing, and he opened the notebook to the very first entry. Carol Ashby, April 14, 2012. He had written down most of it that first evening. He had thought at the time that he had written down all of it. But reading it now, reading it with 11 years of subsequent entries behind him, reading it with the cold of his office still sitting in his bones and the propofol smell still faint in his clothing, he realized there was a line he had recorded but not transcribed. A line he had marked with a small asterisk and then, apparently, deliberately not rendered into readable notation. As though some part of him, 11 years ago on the first night of all this, had already known there would come an evening when he would need to sit with this book and find something true at the bottom of it. He read his own shorthand slowly. He translated it word by word the way you might defuse something. What Carol Ashby had said in that deep corridor between sedation and the surgical plane on April 14, 2012, was this: *, it follows the pen. Don't give it a reason to follow yours. If you've already started, if you're reading this because you've already started, then you need to understand what you've opened. It doesn't create what it writes. It records what you've already made possible. You are the author of every entry. It only holds the pen. *. He sat with that for a very long time. The kitchen was quiet. The locked back door was still locked. Outside, the October wind moved through the Sycamore Hill trees in long, slow passes, and the sound of it against the narrow Victorian house was the sound of something enormous breathing at a distance. He understood it now. Or he understood enough. The log had not been haunted from outside. There was no entity sitting in his office chair, no presence that had followed him from the operating room, no malevolent intelligence filling pages in the dark while he slept. The patients in the corridor, Carol Ashby, Thomas Garrett, all of them, had not been channeling something external. They had been reflecting something internal. Something he had been building entry by careful entry for 11 years. The corridor between sedation and the surgical plane was real. He had always known that. What he had never understood was that it ran in both directions. That when he sat at the head of those tables and observed, when he watched and catalogued and pressed his professional stillness over everything he felt, he had been sending something back. His attention, his obsession, his meticulous, relentless need to document and preserve and possess what he witnessed. And the corridor had received it, had held it, had given it back in the voices of unconscious people because those were the only moments of transmission available to something that did not operate in the ordinary frequencies of the waking world. Everything that writes gets read. And he had written his own ending because that was what 11 years of this kind of attention produced. A story that wanted, more than anything, to be complete. He sat in that kitchen for a very long time. The coffee he made went cold. The clock on the microwave moved through 10 o'clock, 11, midnight. Then he did the thing he should have done 11 years ago. The thing Carol Ashby had told him to do on the very first night, in a voice borrowed from the deep corridor, in words he had recorded but refused to read for a decade. He burned the logs. Both of them. He burned every notebook. He did it in the kitchen sink with the window cracked and the October air pulling the smoke outward into the dark. And he stood and watched 11 years of his own handwriting become ash. And he did not look away, because not looking away was the only honest thing left to do. He called in sick the following day. And the day after that, he arranged a leave of absence. He sat in his narrow house on Sycamore Hill and he said nothing to no one, and November 2nd came and went in ordinary silence. A gray Thursday, rain against the windows, traffic sounds from the hill road below, the smell of old wood and his own coffee and nothing else. He did not die. He did not go back to work for 2 months. When he did, he was different in some way that his colleagues could not name precisely. Warmer was the word some of them used, which they said with a slight confusion, as though warmth in Elliot Voss was a symptom they weren't sure how to diagnose. He still monitored the corridor. He still watched the faces of sedated people with his dark, still eyes. But he kept no record. He wrote nothing down. And when a patient's lips moved in that deep place between sleep and the surgical plane, he listened, and he let it pass, and he did not give it anywhere to go. He never spoke about any of it. Not to his sister, not to any colleague, not to anyone who would later think to write any of this down. What we know comes from the final notebook, the second one, retrieved from the hospital office, which was not burned, which was taken by a cleaning staff member who found it on the desk and brought it to hospital administration, who contacted the department head, who contacted 2 other people, who contacted the individuals who eventually brought this account forward. The notebook is currently held in private hands. Its contents have never been officially verified. The investigation into the anomalous entries was closed without findings, classified internally as a confidential HR matter, and everyone who read it in full has said, independently, the same thing, that reading it felt less like reading a document and more like being observed by one. What they mean by that is difficult to describe and impossible to quantify. But if you have ever sat very still in a very quiet room and felt, without any evidence, without any sound or motion, the absolute cellular certainty that something in that room was paying attention to you, then you already understand. The log is what happens when you give your obsession enough pages. It stops being a record of what you've seen. It becomes a record of what you've become. And the truly terrifying thing, the thing that Elliot Voss understood at last in his kitchen at midnight watching 11 years of handwriting burn, is that it had never been showing him the future. It had only ever been showing him the cost of refusing to look away. Some doors, once opened, will stand open. The only question is whether you're the one who walked through, or the one who built the frame. Every week, Mindshift Stories brings you the cases that keep investigators awake at night, the ones too disturbing for mainstream media. If that sounds like something you need, subscribe now and never miss a story.